A police officer stopped a black doctor, believing that an expensive car could not belong to someone with his skin color. He detained him on the road, ignoring his pleas about the urgency of the situation. Neither of them knew that the doctor was rushing to the hospital to save the life of the officer's own son. What happened next would shock even those who have seen it all. But let's start from the beginning. Dr. Ellis Grant, a renowned black surgeon, was speeding down a deserted road in the early morning. He had just received an emergency call. An 8-year-old boy was in critical condition after an accident. Time was running out, and every passing moment pushed the child closer to the edge between life and death. At an intersection, the flashing lights of a police car forced Ellis to hit the brakes. He pulled over to the shoulder, suppressing his frustration. From the patrol car emerged an officer, a middle-aged white man. His wary eyes immediately swept over Ellis's face, and then to the gleaming Tesla. As the officer approached, he seemed to appraise the car's value and the appearance of its driver. Remaining calm, Grant handed over his documents, but he noticed how the officer hesitated, scrutinizing his license. The officer's gaze was heavy, filled with suspicion. After checking the documents, the officer lingered near the car, asking questions unrelated to the situation. The sense of bias was unmistakable. Grant explained that he was a surgeon rushing to the hospital on an emergency call, but his words seemed to make no impression. Instead, the officer called in a check on the car's plates. 10 minutes had passed. Ellis watched as the officer continued to pace around the car, casting cautious glances at him. It felt as though the officer was deliberately stalling. A growing sense of despair overtook Grant. Somewhere in the hospital, a child might die because of a prejudiced delay. The officer opened the trunk, found nothing, but still persisted with his inspection. It seemed like he was searching for any excuse to detain Ellis further. After 15 minutes, the check was complete. The officer reluctantly handed back the documents and allowed him to leave, casually remarking that he should watch his speed. Ellis raced toward the hospital, but the lost time already felt irreversible. As his car cut through the air, his mind spiraled with the thought that the color of his skin had nearly cost someone their chance at survival. Ellis pulled into the hospital driveway, braking sharply at the staff entrance. Jumping out of the car, he practically sprinted into the building, where a nurse met him immediately. She quickly briefed him. The child's condition was critical. His blood pressure was dropping rapidly, and his chances of survival were fading fast. Ellis was the only doctor in the city capable of performing the complex surgery required. His expertise in pediatric vascular microsurgery made him indispensable in cases like this. Only he had the skills to repair the child's damaged arteries without risking catastrophic consequences. That's why he had been called in without delay, because every second counted. In the operating room, the surgical team was already waiting for him. On the monitors, the boy's vitals were plummeting. Ellis quickly reviewed the CT scans. Multiple internal injuries, a ruptured major artery, and a high risk of massive blood loss. Wasting no time, he took control of the situation. As the surgery began, the complexity of the case became clear. The bleeding was far more extensive than anticipated. Standard techniques weren't working, and this was where Ellis's unique expertise made the difference. Using a microscopic instrument and a technique he had developed years ago, Ellis managed to stop the bleeding without requiring the amputation of any damaged organs. The operation lasted 2.5 hours. Every step demanded absolute focus and precision. Ellis knew that without his intervention, the child wouldn't survive the night. Finally, the boy's condition stabilized, and he was moved to the ICU. Ellis removed his gloves, wiped his forehead, and walked out into the hallway to deliver the news to the family. The child had been saved. But in the waiting room, Ellis wasn't just greeted by the boy's father. He also recognized the familiar face of the police officer who had stopped him that morning. Ellis stepped out of the operating room, exhaling deeply. The boy was stable, the surgery was a success, but the tension hadn't left him. He quickly made his way to the waiting area, where the child's parents were expected to be. In the hallway, he noticed a woman sitting in a chair with red, tear-streaked eyes. She stood up as soon as she saw Ellis, but didn't get a chance to say anything before a man appeared beside her. Ellis recognized him instantly. It was the same police officer who had stopped him earlier that morning. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Officer Brian Steele stood motionless, staring at the doctor he had detained just hours ago. His face showed a mixture of surprise and discomfort. Maintaining his professional composure, Ellis looked into the eyes of the boy's mother and calmly said, "Your son is stable. The surgery was successful, but he's still under observation. The next 24 hours will be critical." The woman burst into tears, thanking him profusely and gripping his hands tightly. Brian, on the other hand, stood silent, his head lowered. Finally, he found the courage to speak. "Doctor, I didn't know you were rushing to help my son." Ellis didn't respond immediately. He exhaled slowly and said, "And I tried to explain it to you." The doctor's words were clear, but there was no anger in his tone, just exhaustion. The officer fell silent again, visibly burdened by the weight of his actions. The stillness was interrupted by a nurse who approached Ellis with an update on the boy's condition. After reviewing the information, Ellis nodded briefly and walked away, leaving Brian alone with his thoughts. At that moment, the officer realized just how close he had come to letting his prejudice rob his son of the chance to live. Ellis returned to his office, still processing the events of the day. He had managed to save the boy's life, but the delay caused by the encounter on the road left a lingering bitterness. As he reviewed the patient's latest reports, the door to his office opened slightly. Standing in the doorway was Officer Brian Steele. Brian looked defeated. His usual confident posture was gone, his shoulders slumped, and his eyes darted around the room, avoiding Ellis's gaze. For a moment, he remained silent before speaking softly. "Dr. Grant, I need to apologize." Ellis closed the file in front of him and looked up. His expression was calm, but his eyes reflected his weariness. "I didn't realize the consequences of my actions," Brian continued. "If you hadn't made it in time, it would have been the end for my son. I was wrong." Ellis listened intently, not interrupting. Then, in a steady voice, he replied, "You acted in the way you thought was appropriate, but your bias nearly cost your son his life." Brian nodded, his face flushing with shame. "You're right. I should have listened to you. I just saw you and assumed. You assumed someone who looks like me couldn't own a car like that or be rushing to a job that saves lives." Ellis interjected, his voice calm but firm, his words carrying undeniable weight. Brian had no response. He stood silently, his head bowed, as the silence grew heavier in the room. "Your son is alive," Ellis said finally. "That's what matters most. But think about how many times situations like this end differently." The officer nodded, still unable to meet Ellis's gaze, and quietly left the office. The story didn't go unnoticed. By the next day, it was the talk of the hospital. Other doctors shared their own experiences of encountering bias, and nurses praised Ellis for his professionalism in handling such an emotionally charged situation. A few weeks later, the hospital received an anonymous letter from Brian. In it, he not only thanked Ellis for saving his son's life, but also admitted that the incident had forced him to confront his prejudices and reevaluate how he approached his work. For Ellis, it was just another day on the job, but he knew this case would remain in Brian's memory as the moment when his own bias almost destroyed his family. In that realization lay perhaps the most important victory of all.